Hello, welcome. All right, so now what we are going to do is we're getting into the end of the semester. We're getting into the alleged causes of the Civil War. And then after that, the Civil War itself. All right, so let me get your names down. Um, Thank you for your patience on grading. I took a vacation and as I warned you at the very beginning, and I'm engaged in a camp from 8 to noon daily, and I have a second class. But you guys are coming. It's coming up, whereby I'm going to play catch up with the grading process. So thank you for your patience. All right. Um, when you get into the alleged causes of the Civil War, what you do is you deal with the whole issue of our alleged identity, right? And as you recall, probably, court history contends that we are an exceptional country, right? That we, see here, that we are an exceptional country and that we were born upon, going back to the War for Independence in your earlier class, the earlier U.S. history class, for particularly the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, the Scottish liberal Whig movement, all of which highlighted human rights, right, as well as civic rights. And with human rights, it's the idea that you're entitled to them by virtue of having been born as a human being, made, created in God's image. And even the non-religious deists attested to that in the 1740s, and that's where you see a lot of our rhetoric during the quote revolution, right? The rights of man. And so with that, however, there's a huge discrepancy, among others, in the institution of slavery, right? Okay, human rights, but yet we're still following England and Rome and declaring African slaves to be, quote, chattel property. That doesn't make any sense. And so, of course, there were those who saw the contradiction. The Quakers, for instance, some of the enlightened founding fathers, 5 northern states issued emancipation proclamations for their slaves in light of the fact that they knew that was a clear violation of their own rhetoric of what we claim to be standing for as a country, right? And so the idea goes is that during the time of the founding fathers, is that they had to make a deal with the devil, that they had to concede to pragmatism because the lobbyist power of the slave owners was just too strong. They had too much money invested in cash crops that were worked by slave labor, and they were not willing to let that go. But you also have the notion, as Abraham Lincoln mentioned quite often in his campaigning, is the notion that some of the founding fathers, some of the leading founding fathers, not only knew that it was a contradiction and a violation of our rhetoric of what we claim to stand for as a country, but also that it was a doomed institution, that they had set it up, for instance, to vote in 1807 or 1808 on the end of the slave trade, in which it did pass. And so hence that slavery would die out like a gangrenous limb, Abraham Lincoln used to say. And so they thought also with industrialization happening in the antebellum period, the years before the Civil War, mainly the 1830s through 1850s, they felt as if slavery, the writing were on the wall, right? And that was a common argument. Then you had people who took an amoral stance toward it and contended slavery is it's archaic. It's from an old school bygone era. It needs to pass. It's not efficient. I mean, after all, right? What incentive do slaves have to work hard besides avoidance of the lash and punishment. They're certainly not getting paid a penny for it. And they know that their kids are going to be born into it, and their kids, et cetera, according to the slave codes begun in the 1640s. And so some people contended, no, you need to give those jobs to wage laborers. Particularly, some were who were opposed on these grounds to slavery, even took a racist bent to it and said, we need to give those jobs on the plantation to white men who will be paid in wages, sort of like tenant sharecroppers, and have an opportunity for advancement. And then with some of those who took this stance, they even dabbled with the idea of Liberia. Liberia was a country established, a zone established in West Africa for the repatriation of, quote, Negroes. And it had some popularity in the antebellum period, because what the idea was is like what Jefferson said. Jefferson had said, we have the wolf by the ears and we dare not let go, right? That the notion that African Americans are going to be so bitter, so enraged by just the generations of suffering and injustice and unrequited labor and separations. And we've talked about these when we did the Southern colonies. And actually that would be, in this class, the separation of family members, the use of psychological torment, and so forth. So some people believed on those grounds that African slaves will be a source of incitement, of rebellion. And so it'd be better if they just move away. And then others, right, took a very racist, essentialist take on it and just afforded the African Americans into a completely other category, as if they were almost not human. And that integration between Black and white people living amongst one another, marrying one another, having children with one another, was just seen, especially in the South, as anathema. That just could not happen. And sadly, anti-miscegenation laws against such will occur all the way into the civil rights movement in your next U.S. history class. So there's been a long tradition of that phobia. Then you had other people who contended, well, they should not be, slavery on principle is wrong. African Americans are humans. So therefore we ought to end the institution on principle. But after that, they were almost indifferent as to what opportunities they would be afforded, what rights they might or may not be afforded, etc. So you could oppose slavery for various reasons, some not moral. And then you could have a myriad of stances on what to do with them after they are free. But then you had a minority, right? And when I mean minority, I definitely mean minority. I've read some historians who contend that true evangelical abolitionists constituted about 2.5% of the population. Now, I'm not sure how accurate that is, but it was a pretty respectable author. So you had that small minority who contended, no, they are human beings. They need to not only be freed, but they need to be afforded, as our rhetoric claims from the founding of our nation, to all the rights, opportunities, protections, responsibilities of citizenship. And they ought to be, quote, integrated, allowed to integrate with the white population. So at any rate, that idea, right, you run into a bit of a historical dilemma, an argumentative dilemma, is you think, okay, if it was only 2.5% of the population, then it sounds like this was not a crusade, this civil war to end slavery. What court history contends, remember, court history is slanted, it's patriotic, it praises our country, it makes us look exceptional, idealistic, courageous, progressive, etc., right? Is what they're going to contend is that 2.5% right, made a lot of noise disproportionate to their small numbers, right, that struck a chord with a lot of Americans who were proverbially on the fence or indifferent about the issue of slavery. Because remember, in all northern states, with the exception of Delaware, slavery had been abolished by the time of the Civil War. So it wasn't an issue that they were familiar with coming into 1861, the beginning of the Civil War. So the idea is that in addition to the noise made by these minority reformers, is you had polarizing events happen in the 1850s. Remember, if something's polarizing, like with magnetism, it causes a great bifurcation of right versus left. It pulls things in one direction or in an opposing direction, right? And so the argument goes in court history that the crusade by the few, in addition to polarizing events that happened in the 1850s, caused enough uproar and forced the nation to have a political confrontation and discourse on slavery. Because for generations before that, right, it was the elephant in the room that you just didn't mention. You look in the 1820s and so forth, and with the Missouri Compromise, the idea was just that, is anything to avoid war. We'll compromise on this slavery issue, but not anymore. So how does this happen? Well, for one, right, is you absolutely have evidence in the antebellum period for growing sense of idealism in that generation of the 1830s through 50s. Remember, with idealism, I just simply define it to myself as you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be. You want to improve the world. You have grand plans for societal and individual improvement, right? So you could look at a myriad of reforms that just sprouted up in this time period. There was a temperance reform against alcoholism, and they would go to taverns. They would have awakenings at the churches. They would go to their state legislators, and they would urge people to either shut down the taverns or sign pledges that they would not drink again. And you had traveling armies on this crusade, if you will. You also, in the antebellum period, had a movement against vagrancy, crime, and prostitution, because cities in the Jacksonian era began burgeoning, many cities. New ones created, the older ones began to grow exponentially. And so with a sudden burst of population in the cities, you almost inevitably are going to face problems, urban problems, right? What to do with sewage and garbage disposal, what to do about crime and safety, etc. And so what are you going to do with the homeless? And so they began movements in cities throughout the country, urban renewal movements at this time. So supposedly that's another source of indication that maybe, just maybe, this antebellum generation was exceptional. It stood out as being idealistic and wanting to improve the world. You also had a movement for education. Horace Mann and public school systems from Massachusetts. They tried to spread the public school systems throughout the nation. And remember, Thomas Jefferson wanted to call for a crusade against ignorance. He said that it was vital for citizens in making wise decisions in elections, etc. And should they be elected as candidates, to be educated, to be well informed on a myriad of topics. So you had an educational crusade that went on at this time. You also had a crusade in trying to reform the reforming institutions. And namely, those were prisons. And I'm going to use the term they used at this time, which of course is no longer the lexicon used, but they called them insane asylums. And so Dorothy Dix and other crusaders went to Congress, went to multiple state legislators, and tried to establish a uniform reformatory approach to helping people that might today be diagnosed with schizophrenia, acute bipolarism, etc. And with the prisons, they wanted them no longer to be punitive, but they wanted them to reform people so that there would be a lower rate of recidivism, of people getting out of prison and then committing a crime and going right back in. So you had a movement for that as well. You had religious movements. In addition to the Second Great Awakening, which was earlier, you had the birth of the Mormon religion with Joseph Smith and his alleged epiphany in New York. And then he moved to Nauvoo, Illinois, where he and his followers were persecuted and arrested, etc. He would, of course, be martyred. And then his followers would make an agreement with the federal government to move to Utah. But in addition to that, you had other religious stirrings at that time going on in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. In addition to that, you also had the famous Transcendentalists. And the Transcendentalists it was mainly an intellectual movement, and that they were very philosophical and trying to devise what you might argue as the first American indigenous philosophical worldview and system. But yet they borrowed. They borrowed pantheism from the Native Americans. They borrowed ideas from Hinduism, and they borrowed ideas from the Romantic movement back in Europe. But I simplistically, tongue-in-cheek, sometimes call them intellectual hippies. Many of them, like their leaders, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, were against institutional deference, right? Just because the main institutions of church and state, government, etc., schools, tell you something and try to teach you normative behavior and try to inform your worldview, they told people to doubt everything, to question everything, and to go by their own deductive reasoning and their own experience. So Henry David Thoreau went out to Walden Pond, away from civilization, to try to ponder the meaning of life, and bring himself to very Spartan conditions so that he could be more pensive and less distracted by modernity. But he especially, right, he wrote a tract on civil disobedience and contended that there are natural laws to the universe, including ethical ones. And a lot of it came down to Christ's golden rule, right? Treat others as you would want them to treat you. And so he contended that if a mere civic law, man-made law, violated that higher natural law, it was your duty, not just your right. It was your moral obligation to defy that civic law in protest, to have it changed and made amenable to natural law. So not only that, the Transcendentalists thought that everyone ought to be economically and intellectually autonomous. They ought to be the arbiters of their own destiny, chase after their own meaning of freedom. It reminds me a little bit of 100 years later, more than 100 years later, with the Beatniks, Jack Kerouac and those guys in the 1950s. Travel, experience life yourself. Come up with your own meaning for your purpose in this universe. Don't have anybody tell you what that meaning is. But they said overall, every human being ought to be free to do such, to engage in ontological introspection and find out his or her own meaning and purpose in life. And of course, that included African Americans, because a human is a human, right? So it shouldn't surprise you that the Transcendentalists were against slavery, morally, on principle. All right. And then you also have, and I'm sure I've omitted a couple that I'm not presently remembering, but you have the abolitionists. And with the abolitionists, they were seen as radical in that they were not willing to be constricted by the Constitution, because there is a contract clause in the Constitution that states that all contracts made before the Federal Union of 1787 were to be recognized and valid afterward. You also have mention of when they look for number of citizens and therefore number of House reps to be elected into Congress. They said not counting persons in bondage. So they were separated from citizenry in the Constitution. And so, but not only that, we have a federal republic, right? And that is that it's a balance between a unitary government, when the central government dictates everything to the local governments, which we don't have, obviously, and a confederacy in which the states are virtually independent, with a few exceptions. And no, we don't have that either, right? So we have a balance of that. So you have constitutional issues to address and saying, well, I'm looking at Article 1, Section 8 of what Congress specifically has the power to do, and nothing on there can be found about slavery. So a lot of people contended it's a state issue, therefore, according to the 10th Amendment, that states that, you know, everything not expressly given to the federal government as far as expressed powers is to be reserved to the states. And so there's a lot going on, right? A lot of issues to juggle. The abolitionists did not care. They didn't care about the constitutional difficulties. They wanted the federal government to end slavery everywhere. All right. So there was a sense of big government behind the abolitionists that a lot of libertarian Americans had a hard time swallowing, right? Because remember, libertarian, you fear government, you distrust government, you want it as small and accountable as possible, and not to mention decentralized as possible. So William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most famous abolitionists, he saw the difficulties that were opposing his crusade in the Constitution. So before a crowd, he grabbed a copy of the Constitution and he burnt it. And they almost lynched him. They grabbed him and actually hanged him from a light pole, and the police saved him in time. But such was the controversy of this, for you just to be willing to say, you know what, the federal government ought to have the power to tell Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, that it has to emancipate its slaves. So a lot to juggle here, right? And the abolitionists didn't care. The abolitionists did not like the argument simply that Black slaves' jobs should be given to white men. They were more revolutionary. They opposed slavery on moral grounds and emphasized the humanity of African Americans and emphasized the need to integrate them to whatever different degrees they disagreed. how integrated they ought to be. The mild abolitionist said we ought to simply give them economic rights. Give them a right to own property, to earn wages, and to buy and sell as they please, but no more than that. More radical abolitionists said, no, we need to give them the power of political participation. We need to give them the power to become citizens and to be protected by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, to sue people in court, to serve in juries, and to elect people, and even in some cases, run for office if they can get elected. And then the last level, in my estimation, of radical abolitionism, they said they need to integrate socially as well as politically and economically. We need to do away with the anti-miscegenation laws and allow Black and white Americans to marry, intermarry, and have children. So there were different degrees of abolitionists throughout the spectrum, right? And so there you have that. The polarizing events. I don't want to keep you forever, but I want to mention a couple. One was the Underground Railroad, right? 19 trips by Harriet Tubman, rescuing over 130 people. This was confiscation, right? In legal terms, in the South, this was absconding, running away with someone else's owned property. And not only that, it was giving them hope, right? And perhaps a reason to want to rebel and abscond themselves when she became so famous. It was spoken of at the time that there were secret six, right? Northern Republicans who were giving her money and support to do this. So then there was anger that this new Republican Party, established in like 1852, 1853, was too radical. Because, by the way, the new radical, the Republican Party stated it was against slavery and the spread thereof to anywhere else in the West. Another component to it, polarizing event, was just the Kansas-Nebraska Act. New states were opening up as we were spreading westwardly and taking it from the Mexican Empire and the Native Americans. So a guy named Stephen Douglas said, why don't we compromise and allow Kansas and Nebraska to vote on the issue themselves, right? So they had a referendum. They had a popular vote on the issue in Kansas. Both sides cheated. They engaged in ballot stuffing, people voting multiple times, people traveling who weren't intending to stay in Kansas, but just going for the election to vote and then leaving. And both sides contended that the other cheated and that they won. The president, Franklin Pierce, did not want to stand up to the South. And he said, you know what? I acknowledge the pro-slavery side. Well, the anti-slavery side refused to step down. And they had a civil war inside Kansas. And it was known as Bleeding Kansas. Literally cannon, battles, everything. And it was all throughout the newspapers. So the democratic process becoming applied to the decision-making process of deciding in the West if these new states could have slaves did not work, right? And that scared a lot of people. You also had the Dred Scott case. His master not only died, but moved him up into the North. And he contended he was on free soil and that his master was dead. And he sued for his freedom, Well, the master's wife had a fallout with her sons. Her sons actually sided with Dred Scott and wanted to see him freed because they grew up with him as a quasi brother. But she won. It went to the Supreme Court, and Roger B. Taney contended that, first of all, no Black man has a right to represent himself in court. And then he stated that slaves, he went back to Rome and England, slaves are chattel property. And that if you own a cow, a horse, a tractor in Alabama, and you move to Ohio, that property is still yours. And so the abolitionists, as well as many people who were on the fence, thought this was way too strong of a decision, moving America backwards when it came to the civil rights for African Americans and emancipation of slaves. So that was another one. You had the Amistad case of slaves who were illegally stolen from West Africa after the end of the slave trade. They fought for and killed their Spanish slave raiders, and then they were caught by the Connecticut, Department of the Navy. Ex-President John Quincy Adams defended them, saying that they were unfairly, illegally kidnapped, and that they had their right to fight for their lives and their freedom. And he actually won. The abolitionists were very encouraged by the Amistad decision, and the South was furious, right? And then let me give you one more if I could, and that is John Brown's raid. John Brown was a religious mystic, a white man from the North, who stood up one day in church and said that God, he likened himself to the Archangel Michael, and said God had called him to fight in the war of righteousness against evil. And he tried to foment a slave rebellion in Virginia. The slaves were too scared to join him. He literally only came down with 19 men. They had a shootout. His two boys were killed. He was captured, and he had a very publicized trial before the state of Virginia had him hanged. And it got a lot of people's attention, and everybody was talking about it. So events such as these had people, were almost making people choose a side, if you will. All right. And then lastly with this is Abraham Lincoln's alleged evolution, right? Note how I contend on this one that Abraham Lincoln began moderately. He said slavery needs to die out, right? And that as a symbolic gesture, they need to end slavery in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. But he stopped there. He stood up for the rights of abolitionists who were being killed, but he, at the time, did not address slavery itself, but just the First Amendment rights of the abolitionists, like Elijah Lovejoy up in the North, who was murdered for being an abolitionist. And then he finally takes a highly publicized stand when he's running for senator. And he's cornered by his opponent, the same Stephen Douglas who tried to make a compromise in Kansas. And he said, so you're telling me that you don't think the decision of slavery ought to be decided democratically by the people of this country? And Lincoln said, no, I don't. I don't believe the average person is well informed enough. And we have a republic, not a democracy. And I think that it ought to be made by the National Congress. And he says, but what happens if everybody in Kansas, because it was before the vote, votes for slavery? Would you, as a congressman, be foretelling the entire state of Kansas, you can't have slaves, even though everyone therein in that state chose slavery? And Lincoln stood his ground and said, yes, I would, because slavery is immoral and the federal government has veto power over the states. So at that point, Lincoln developed a reputation down in the South as a tyrant, as the man who doesn't care what Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Kansas wants. The National Congress on the East Coast gets to decide on slavery. All right. So he made enemies there for sure. He has quotes where he tore into the rationale for slavery. Take a look at this. This one cracks me up. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have right enslaved B, why may not B snatch the same argument, even prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It's color then, that the lighter has the right to enslave the darker? Take care, but by this rule, you are to become the slave to the first man that you meet with fairer skin than your own. Oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually superior to the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them? Take care again, for by this rule, you will become the slave of the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. So he knew how to make enemies of the South, right? But because he was not for, because see, what he contended is he wanted Congress to declare that slavery could not extend anywhere else, right? In any of these new Western states. But he contended he did not believe Congress had the right to interfere with slavery where it already had been established by state law years before. That's why he was hated by the South as a tyrant, telling the West what to do with slavery, but disdained by some of the leading abolitionists as being too lukewarm and not bold enough to tell Alabama, Mississippi, etc., that their slaves had to be manumitted. So as often happens, when you find yourself kind of in the middle, you make enemies on both sides. And that's exactly what Lincoln did. However, as the war proceeded, Louisiana was taken by our Navy, right? Who came into the Gulf of Mexico and took over the coast and thereby took over the state as the first Southern state to fall to the Union. Because by the way, right, 11 Southern states in the South, when he was elected in 1860, seceded. They left the Union. He contended they had no such right, no constitutional right, and he tried to treat them as rebels. But then they declared if they were just rebels, then they weren't going to exchange prisoners of war. And so he begrudgingly acknowledged them during the Civil War as, for the time, a separate seceded country. And that's exactly what they established, right? So they established the Confederacy, the Stars and Bars. They made it very clear that their country was predicated on the inequality of black and white races. You could find it in their declaration. So in light of that, in light of them largely fighting for their right to preserve their slaves, or at least to decide themselves if they want to preserve their slaves, in light of its use long after the Civil War, you could probably see how the stars and bars of the Confederate flag can be seen as backward, racist, and offensive. So they fought for 4 years. And But when Louisiana fell, Lincoln made a speech, and he said, I understand that the new government in Louisiana, controlled by the Union Army, is considering giving some citizenship rights to some, quote, Negroes. And he said that he endorsed it, that it was a good idea. But he had a tinge of elitism in it, because he said, especially those, he said, who were educated or who had fought for the Union Army. All right. And matter of fact, in one way that, as you see in this write-up, it led to his demise. John Wilkes Booth heard that speech and said, you know, citizenship to inwards. He said that man just gave his last speech. And of course, he ended up shooting him and killing him at Ford Theater. So at any rate, that's court history. That we finally fought to preserve, to uphold, to practice that which we preached from the time of the, quote, revolution, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we could thank the abolitionists. We could thank the Republican Party. We could thank all the reformers, the transcendentalists, etc., for making all the noise that they made. And by the way, the cylindrical rotary printing press printed everything they did. You had abolitionists up from New York who were stuffing the mail into the South with abolitionist rhetoric. And then you also had the famous, what were they called? They were intellectual fairs. I have it written somewhere on number 1. They were intellectual fairs where you just pay a small fee and you get to listen to multiple experts from a myriad of fields. And at these intellectual fairs, Frederick Douglass became a public star. My goodness, look at some of the autobiographical stories that Frederick Douglass, as a runaway slave from Maryland, had to share. They literally will bring tears to your eyes. Super sad stories. The Grimke sisters, white girls from the South, who ran away from South Carolina and went on a tour speaking firsthand of all the damage their father, as the master, and the hated middlemen, the overseers, all the damage they incurred upon the slaves. And those are just the most famous instances. Number 2, as you could guess from the title, disagrees. It says, you know what? This was a minority making all this noise. You look at a lot of the people in power, including Republican politicians, and freeing the slaves and helping them was not their first priority. You have the faction thesis, whereby I said earlier, where some Republicans said, no more slavery in the West. It's going to industrialize. And with the industrialized economy, we will have plenty of jobs and opportunities to move up the socioeconomic pyramid and achieve the American dream for our white voters, instead of plantations of, quote, Negroes. So there were some Republicans, even though the Republican Party was, in its declaration against slavery, like I said, You could be against slavery for a myriad of reasons. Some, even of the Republicans, by today's standards, were racist. Not only that, with the faction thesis, it's the idea that if you have people doing the same thing for a living that you're doing on the East Coast, chances are they will become a factional ally. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same interests and or the same values. And so hence, if they're industrializing with textiles and metallurgy and iron in Nevada as they are in Connecticut, then they're going to vote the same and they're going to win allies in Congress. But if they allow slaves over there, then they're going to vote with the South. Because what's good for one master is going to be good for another. Then it's more than hinted that slaves were not freed. The Emancipation Proclamation, right? Until the North grew desperate. All right. Until it became convenient to free them. You think of divide and conquer. You order the slaves freed in the South. It gives them encouragement to rebel and or run away. And you offer them freedom by coming and joining the Union Army and fighting with the Union Army against the Confederacy. You're gaining allies and help on the battlefield. And then the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts fought so bravely that word spread throughout the North and South of how brave, quote, Negroes were on the battlefield. And the willingness to give them guns increased. So 2 is much more cynical. As you see in the last sentence there, this war was not a crusade. So please, if you would, as usual, choose one to analyze and evaluate, but please read them both. All right, please read them both. Any questions? All right, this one's unique as well. Like the War of 1812 and the Constitution, it's not the same argumentative format. You just choose one. Please choose to address, answer, and support your answer to one of the following questions concerning the fighting in the Civil War. Number 1, defend or refute historian James McPherson's claim. His famous book is called Battle Cry of Freedom. That the Union's loss at the First Battle of Bull Run was a blessing in disguise, and that it convinced the leaders of the U.S. government and of the Northern Armed Forces to make a greater effort to galvanize all available resources in fighting a long, bloody war. So with this, we're we're just getting over COVID conditions. I'm not expecting you to be able to make it to the library and find a great source on this, much less have the time to go to Amazon and buy a book on it. So I'm primarily expecting you to use an online source. But look up the First Battle of Bull Run. See how it was, if you choose this one, should you choose it. See how it was a disaster at the time for the North. But in particular, look up I'm going to put it here in parentheses. It's difficult to see here. Let me see if I shrink it. Yeah. Look up George B. McClellan if you choose number one. He decided that they were going to train and train and train, and that the federal government was going to more than amply provide them with uniforms and guns and ammunition. And he supposedly turned the Union Army into a well-oiled machine after this loss. Number two, contingency. That's the what ifs, right? If one factor had gone down differently, then it would have created domino effect and different results would have followed. Contingency in history deals with the possibility of events turning in an entirely different direction had a certain variable been different. Demonstrate how the South, the Confederacy, may have won the Civil War had a variable of your choosing been different. So, for example, a foreign alliance with Great Britain, the South was on the verge of gaining a military alliance with England, with Great Britain. How may that have changed things? Because one of the central components to the North's victory, arguably, just one, was our naval domination. But you add Britain's navy into the equation, yikes. A larger Southern population or more participation in the Confederacy by the border states. In his book, Battle Cry of Freedom, James McPherson says that the North was very fortunate that a lot of people in the border states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, stuck between the North and South, that a lot of them chose to either stay out of the war or fight with the North. And how things could have been much worse if those border states had been loyal to the Confederacy. A more powerful Confederate Navy, or a victory by way of some change in a key battle, like Antietam, which is, if you look up Antietam, it was kind of a stalemate. Gettysburg. Look up Gettysburg and how close the Confederacy got to taking the North's flank. All right. Or you can look up Jubal Early and his Confederate march to Washington, D.C. And people wonder to this day why he didn't just go all the way to the Capitol and capture it for the South. So those are some examples of the what ifs on the next assignment. And then number three, how successfully did the, quote, Negro soldiers of the 54th Regiment win respect for and trust in African-American soldiers in the future? Yeah, I've had a lot of students in previous semesters choose this one, which I love. It's my favorite as well. But oftentimes they put a lot of focus on what they did, which was great. I loved reading about it, the Battle of Fort Wagner, etc. But not enough on the aftermath. So should you choose number three, your focus should be on the aftermath. What quotes can you get from congressmen, from President Lincoln, maybe different creation of different Black divisions after Fort Wagner when the 54th was decimated. Number four, in light of the carnage of the battles of Shiloh and the battles of the Wilderness, and or Grant's directives to Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, and to William Tecumseh Sherman in the Deep South to momentarily disregard the protocols of war, should present historians revoke the mantle of war hero from Ulysses S. Grant? So if you want, you could look up Grant. You know, he becomes the president. He becomes the guy that Robert E. Lee surrenders to, the main hero for the North. And he had a very rags to riches story where he went to Washington, D.C., asked for a position and was rebuffed. Went back, used his dad's connections in Illinois and got a little regiment. But boy, did he want to fight. And he began accruing victory after victory until it got the attention of the federal government. And they eventually put him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And the Potomac is the river that runs through DC. So the Union or Yankee Army. But there's evidence that he knew Lee was leading him into traps at times, and he still flung his men into the fray, knowing that he had more men to lose than Lee had. He told William Tecumseh Sherman to take what you need from the land instead of legally accommodating it throughout the Deep South. So basically inviting him to pillage and take from the people. He arguably fought dirty, or at least told his men to fight dirty, but he won. And so he was the hero at the end of the war. And then similar context, this is the guy who did a lot of his dirty work. Consider the context of Civil War realities and of what William Tecumseh Sherman experienced. Could and should one defend to any degree the actions of William Tecumseh Sherman and his Union soldiers in the Deep South? He had a breakdown. He was charged with cowardice at Bull Run. He had a breakdown when he was put in control and administrative position in Tennessee. He was there at Shiloh fighting right in the middle of it and saw all types of carnage. He went through depression and almost successfully committed suicide. And it's like something in him snapped. When he went to the Deep South, his men kept getting sniped in the southern cities. So he got to a point where he started telling them, all right, we have someone sniped from the people in this city. Randomly grab 100 people. Give them until noon to tell us who did it. If they don't, execute those 100 civilians in front of everybody else in the city. Yikes. He became the boogeyman in the South. But he has a quote that's often used and abused, right? That war is hell. And that the most merciful thing you could do is to get it done with as quickly as possible. Paraphrase there at the end. And he said the South was too proud and obstinate or stubborn. And he said he needed to break the South's will to fight. He burnt Atlanta to the ground. So at any rate, you have those 5 to think about on the next assignment on fighting the Civil War. So obviously just choose one. I'd like you to use at least one online source. If you happen to have a book, great, even better. All right, so can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel relatively prepared for both these assignments? Thank you, Isabella. Herrera, thank you, Jocelyn. Good, good. All right, great. All right, so before we get off, are there any questions? You guys got this. But again, please, on the previous one, on the alleged causes of the Civil War, if you would, to help, just equip you to make a very intelligent evaluation at the end. Read both before you choose to analyze and evaluate one of the two. All right, read both sides of the argument about whether the Civil War was a crusade to end slavery or not. All right, so that's it, you guys, for me. Thank you. Hang in there. We're almost done. We're almost done. Bye-bye.